From the Victory Studios in downtown Little Rock, this is Capitol View with your host, Jesse Tenor.
Well, good Sunday morning to you and welcome into Capitol View. I'm Jesse Tenor. We're now less than a month away from the 2018 fiscal session right here in the capital city. I'll talk to two lawmakers about the big budgetary issues facing the state this time around. But we begin looking at the effects of the biggest change to the U.S. tax code in decades, passed in December. Joining us in studio is 4th District Congressman Bruce Westerman. Congressman, welcome to the show.
Hey, Jesse, great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Last time we did this, it was over the airways from Washington, D.C., so it's good to be here in the studio.
Yeah, more fun to have you right in studio.
In the new digs you've got
exactly.
here.
Show you around a little. Yeah. So yeah, let's start with the GOP tax plan a little bit. I know even just kind of in passing, Arkansans have said that there's been so much back and forth. Sometimes it's kind of difficult to say, okay, this is where we landed.
Right.
And so, you know, we've seen big moves from companies that last week, like Walmart. But when it comes to the average working class Arkansan, how does this affect them?
Well, I look at it from the perspective of my constituents in the 4th District of Arkansas. You know, I gathered data, and the median household income there is about $42,000 per year. 82% of the tax filers in my district were using the standard deduction in the old tax code. So when you look at on the individual side in the new tax code, we're doubling the standard deduction. You lose the personal exemptions, but if you've got children, your tax credit doubles. So the vast majority of constituents in the 4th District are going to benefit greatly just from what's being done on the individual side. I think everybody's going to benefit from what we've done on the business side, where we're lowering the corporate rate, we're lowering the rate for pass-throughs. We're already seeing, as you mentioned, you know, Walmart announced increasing the minimum wage for Walmart employees, giving bonuses. We've seen it from Bank of the Ozarks. We've seen it from AT&T. A lot of businesses in Arkansas have come out and publicly said, we're doing this because of the tax reform bill. There was a lot of talk on the other side about how this was going to take from poor people and give it to rich people, and it's doing just the opposite. It's putting more money back in the pockets of hardworking Arkansans so they can spend that the way they see fit. It's putting more money back into businesses so they can reinvest in their business here in Arkansas, which will create more jobs and higher paying jobs and better wages for Arkansans. So I think it's really creating a winning situation here.
Supporters of the bill like yourself are looking at some of these immediate effects for taxpayers. A lot of the Democratic opposition to this bill was, you know, focused more long-term, pointing out that many of those individual cuts expire after a few years while the corporate tax cuts are permanent. And so do you kind of expect the individual cuts to be extended, and then would you support that?
I would hope so. I've already supported it. We wanted to make the tax cuts permanent in the House, but the people who are talking about the tax cuts not being permanent on the individual side, they need to ask, well, why aren't they permanent on the individual side? The reason is because to make them permanent, you've got to have 60 votes in the Senate. Remember, we did the tax reform through budget reconciliation that only required a simple majority or 51 votes in the Senate. With 60 votes in the Senate, we can change whatever we want to for as long as we want to. So the other side might need to go talk to some of their Democratic senators and say, hey, why don't you get behind making these tax cuts permanent? Because I believe the will's to do that in the House and on the Republican side in the Senate.
And then you'll actually be working under Arkansas Congressman Steve Womack now. He was officially named chairman of the House Budget Committee this week. And so how do you think his different background compared to the past two chairs, since his background is with Appropriations Committee, how will that affect budgets for agencies moving forward?
Yeah, I'm sure he would appreciate that, you saying I'll be working under him or for him. Or, but no, Steve's he's a great guy. I'm so happy to see him as chairman of the Budget Committee. He and I served together on that committee. This is a milestone because it's the first time in a long time that a member of Congress from Arkansas has chaired a committee. And I think we've got a great team up there. I think we're going to see more Arkansas members chairing committees. Some of us have subcommittee chairmanships already. But it takes time to establish yourself and gain the trust of your colleagues to chair those committees, and Steve has certainly done that. I look forward to working with him specifically on budget process reform. We're operating under budget rules that were passed in the early 1970s. If you followed the tax bill, you kept hearing things about bird baths and the bird rule. Well, that's from Senator Byrd, from archaic rules that were put in place that the Senate are still using to block things like making the tax cuts on the individual side permanent. So we can address that through the budget process reform. The mission of the Budget Committee is to set the cap for expenditures and the floor for revenue. So we create the framework that the Appropriations Committee uses to write funding bills, and that the Ways and Means Committee uses to write tax legislation. So it's an important committee, and again, congratulations to Steve, and I wish him well.
And much more with Congressman Westerman coming up after a quick break. You're watching Capitol View on Sunday morning.
You're watching Capitol View, Sunday morning talk focused on the political scene in Arkansas.
Welcome back to the show, Capitol viewers. We are back with 4th District Congressman Bruce Westerman. You're heading back to Washington after this, and as of now, we're facing a Friday deadline to avoid a government shutdown. Immigration policy is, of course, at the forefront over this fight of funding for the government. So do you think a shutdown will happen?
I think that's going to be up to the Democrats if it happens. Again, it takes 60 votes in the Senate to pass the funding bill. I wouldn't say that immigration is at the forefront of the fight. I would say that Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer would like to make immigration at the forefront of the fight. Ever since the president made his executive order to repeal the executive order from the previous administration, which I think was unconstitutional, to establish the DACA program, he put that back into the hands of Congress. And we have working groups. We have people that have been meeting for hours and weeks coming up with legislation, the right thing to do. And we'll have a plan that addresses border security, that addresses operational security, where you keep track of people when they're in the country. It'll address the guest worker program, and it'll address the DACA issue and the people who are brought here as children. They're illegal, but not at their fault. Oh, they're illegal. They were brought here as infants or toddlers, many of them. And we'll find a way not to create a new pathway to citizenship, but to give them status so that they can work through the immigration process like anybody else that immigrates to the country. The president's playing a key role in this. He wants funding for the wall and for border security. I think the American public supports protecting our borders and making sure our country's secure, wants to limit the number of immigrants that we're bringing in. So I think we're going to come up with a solution. I don't think it'll be part of the budget caps agreement and the funding bill that happens on the 19th, but I think it'll happen shortly thereafter. And I think people are working in good faith to come up with the good legislation that Congress needs to do. It doesn't need to be an executive order from the administrative branch.
Speaking of immigration, it's kind of impossible to ignore some comments that Trump allegedly made, I guess on Thursday, in which people were in a meeting with him at the White House, said he referred to African nations using an obscene term that we are not allowed to use on this show, but I think everybody knows what you're talking about, referring to a certain whole. So what's your reaction to the comment and then the fallout from it? Yeah, well, obviously, there's a lot of fallout from it. I wasn't at the meeting. He says he didn't say it. I don't know. He said, she said. Right. But the bottom line is we've got to do something to address the immigration issue. We've got to do something to address our guest worker program and securing our borders. What the president says, I can't control that, but I do know he's being effective at policy passed. He's being effective at working with Congress to solve solutions, and so far I've been pleased with the efforts that he's putting forth. I know in the meetings I've been in with him, he's very engaged. He is about solving problems and really working hard, and he's surrounded himself with good cabinet members and staff that have really reached out and are working very diligently with Congress. Vice President Pence included. He spends a lot of time over at the Capitol. He was a member of Congress himself, and the atmosphere and the engagement with Congress in this administration versus the last administration is really night and day. Something interesting that we have been seeing, though, from some of your Republican colleagues is a lot of them have been announcing their retirements or running for different positions. Why do you think that is?
Well, you get some of that every election cycle. You're seeing resignations because of personal issues. You're seeing resignations, people say they're just tired of serving in Congress. There's a whole spectrum of why people are retiring and why they're not. I can tell you it's not the easiest job in the world. There's a lot of travel involved, a lot of time away from home. And I can see how people could get burned out on it. Midterm elections are always exciting times, but I feel good about what we're doing for the country. I feel good about the direction we're taking the country in. And I think voters here in Arkansas and around the country are going to recognize that. It's a long time until the election, but we'll wait and see what happens.
Do you think it'll eventually, though, affect the GOP majority?
Yeah, open seats are harder to defend, but I think we've got a good plan in place. Speaker Ryan's doing an excellent job of helping raise campaign funds. The president, I think, is committed to helping keep the majority in the House. We've got the Senate, you know, that as far as political positioning, there are more Democratic seats up that are vulnerable, or they're in states where President Trump won.
All right, well, hey, I think that's a perfect ending point. Congressman, thank you so much for coming in studio and joining us.
Thank you, Jesse. Always good to be with you.